Learning a language is hard, even for adults who have the advantage of having a syntactical understanding of how language works and being able to apply that to a second language. And yet, within the first 2 years of life, children not only rapidly gain extensive semantic knowledge of what words means, growing their lexicon, but also a great deal of syntactic knowledge about how language works and the different roles words play in a sentence. So to better help you as a new parent understand the process that your child's going to go through to learn language, we're going to start from the very first word they're going to learn to understand and work our way up to having a basic understanding of sentences. And by being equipped with this knowledge, you'll feel more comfortable in sharing language with your child and understanding their development along the way. Now let's start off at the beginning. While your child's first spoken word may be mama or papa or some other word that frequently comes up, the first word that children are almost universally found to understand is their own name. This will just come about naturally as you interact with your baby, speaking to them and using their own name in conversation. Names are one of the easiest word-referent pairings that children are exposed to, and this is why their name is the first word they understand, as well as mama and papa as titles are often their first spoken words. But moving beyond this, things start to get interesting. The first word category that children begin to understand are concrete nouns. These are just basic object word pairings, such as dog, cat, apple, bat, etc. What's interesting is children often have a bias or predisposition to a mental phenomenon known as fast mapping, in which essentially after one or two exposures to a basic concrete noun, a child immediately picks up on the meaning of the word. This typically happens in situations where the word-referent pairing is quite obvious, such as pointing to an object and saying what it is, such as, "This is a pen." But more complex situations, where multiple objects are present and yet you refer to only one, children must use some more complex statistical learning in their mind. To illustrate this, let's say in front of a child there is a dog and there is a cat. With the two animals in front of the child, you say to the child, "The dog is very cute." This sentence, along with the image of the two objects, gets stored in the child's mind and is latent there until future occurrences of that word show up. So a few hours later, there's another situation where there is now a dog and a ball. You once again say to the child, "The dog is cute." Now the child, already having heard that sentence when the dog and the cat were present, now sees a new novel situation in which a dog and a ball are present. The child then looks for the similarities between the two scenes and notices that the sentence or noun usage is the same, and is then able to discern that the dog is the object that is similar between the two situations. So while many of the early concrete nouns children learn are through simple one object, one word, word-referent pairing where a parent points to an object and says the name, children also learn a ton of nouns through this innate statistical learning method that allows them to differentiate between different scenes and different words. The interesting practical implication here is that using a greater vocabulary with your child actually leads to faster learning, which may be counterintuitive because you would expect that with a greater number of words to learn, it may take longer and be more confusing to the child to learn them. But this is actually not the case, as with a greater vocabulary, the chances are significantly lower of multiple ambiguous scenes happening where the two or more objects in view are the same. Essentially, if you have a three-word vocabulary of dog, cat, and ball, and you have an ambiguous scene in which a dog and a cat are present and only one of them is referred to, with the three-word vocabulary, it is very likely that in the future there will be another ambiguous scene with the dog and the cat, making it impossible for the child to distinguish between the two, as there are no differences between the two scenarios. But if the vocabulary consisted of 10, 20, 100 words, the chances of a dog and cat being paired together multiple times in multiple ambiguous scenes is greatly decreased, meaning that both will most likely be paired with other nouns in the future, allowing the child to employ this statistical method of learning that allows children to differentiate ambiguous nouns based off multiple previous exposures. So if you want to expand your child's noun vocabulary, simply use more nouns with them. This doesn't have to be presented in simple word-referent pairings where you explicitly tell the child what an object is. Simply having normal conversation will allow the child to learn using statistical methods that allow them to quickly pick up on nouns. So as a child's knowledge of nouns expands, it then becomes time to introduce verbs, which are significantly more ambiguous and challenging for a child to learn and require more advanced learning methods. As the remainder of the video will deal heavily with the syntax of language, I'm going to introduce a few terms that are basic syntax rules that your child will begin to implicitly learn and understand through exposure to language. The first distinction we have is transitive and intransitive sentences. In a transitive sentence, a verb essentially has two arguments, a noun preceding and a noun proceeding after the verb. Some examples of this are John swung the bat, Sally ate the sandwich. So in transitive sentences, we are given the subject, who is the doer of the verb, and we are given the object of the verb. This is compared to intransitive sentences in which only one of the two is given, such as Sally ran, John jumped. The second relationship we must understand is causal versus unspecified object sentences. For example, in a causal sentence, you might say, the lamp broke. In this scenario, the lamp is the object of the verb. In an unspecified object sentence, you might say, Sally swung. In this sentence, Sally is the doer of the verb. It is important to note that while they differ in their meaning, these two sentences are structurally identical, with a noun preceded by a verb. Understanding these two syntactic distinctions are very important to understanding how children come to learn to understand verbs. Seeing these various syntactical contexts should give you a good idea of the various obstacles and challenges that children are presented with when learning verbs. But what extensive research has shown is that children will latch on to these structures and syntaxes of sentences when there is an unknown word, especially verbs, to try to get hints as to what the meaning could possibly be. This is a phenomenon known as syntactic bootstrapping and is the foundation for how children begin to learn verbs. While there are two prevailing, opposing ideas in linguistic development theory, particularly lexical account theory, which states that children learn both semantic meaning and syntactical meaning on a word-per-word basis. So for example, if a child is presented with the sentence, he hit the ball, a child will come to understand that hit will be preceded by a subject and followed by the object of the action, but will not take this structure and apply it to any other nouns. The alternative understanding, early abstraction account theory, states that while semantic meaning of words is on a word-by-word basis, learning syntax is something that children will represent in their minds in a way that can be applied to various other words when they see these patterns cropping up in conversation. Extensive research and studies of these two theories have been conducted, and early abstraction accounts is heavily supported and does a great deal in defining how we understand linguistic development in children. There are countless studies that have been done and show children have an innate ability to latch onto syntax and apply that to future scenarios with different words. This is particularly apparent in situations where a child is exposed to a sentence without any visual representation of the event that happens. So they're given a sentence with a verb, but there's nothing visual to go along with this to give them any clues as to what the verb means. So while the child derives little to no semantic meaning from the verb usage in this sentence, they do get hints about the structure and syntax of the sentence. And now in future scenarios where the same verb is used, but now with a visual representation of what is happening, the child has an advantage in understanding not only the verb, but also the doer and the object of the verb. So essentially, no sentence is wasted on a child. If there is visual representations or hints as to what a word might mean, they're gaining semantic knowledge of this word. But if there's not, they're gaining syntactical knowledge about sentences and language in general. This ability for information and understanding to lay latent and then be applied to future scenarios is what allows children to have such fast linguistic development within the first few years of their life, and is why any exposure to the language is incredibly important for aiding children in development. Now, a situation which allows us to really appreciate the complex nuance of a child's linguistic development through syntactic bootstrapping is their ability to tell the difference between causal and unspecified object sentences in an intransitive syntax. These are sentences such as the lamp broke or Sally ran. The challenge here, of course, is that the structure of the sentences are identical, and yet the role of the nouns in the sentences are different. So when met with this sentence, children will first use their syntactic knowledge to realize that this is an intransitive usage of a verb, which they derive from the fact that there is only one noun and one verb in the sentence, and the noun comes before the verb, and there is no noun following the verb. The number of verb arguments is a massive hint children use to understand the structure of a sentence. Once they've applied their syntactic knowledge of the sentence to understand that this is an intransitive usage of a verb, they then go on to apply semantic knowledge to further aid their understanding of the sentence. To determine whether the noun is the subject of the verb or the object of the verb, children will take any semantic knowledge they have about the noun and they'll apply it to it. While there are many factors that will clue children in to the role of the noun in the sentence, the primary one is object animacy. So essentially, if the noun of the sentence is a human or an animal, children are significantly more likely to say that that noun is the subject of the sentence, the doer of the verb. As opposed to if it's an object, the child is much more likely to say that the verb, the action, is happening to the noun in the sentence. Not only are these assumptions generally linguistically correct, but also help show that children take syntactic and semantic knowledge from previous exposures to the language to help them understand sentences in which they might not fully understand every single word. Now, a particularly convincing observation in regard to this innate syntactic understanding of language in children is found in deaf children who at home invent gestures to communicate with their parents and family. And when signing verbs, they will have a similar structure and number of argument slots, that is, the nouns coming before and after the verb, as to spoken language. So not only do we see children instinctively picking up on syntactic patterns in spoken language, we can actually see children inventing similar syntactic patterns in gestures with no exposure to spoken language. So what does this all mean practically for you as a new parent? Well, as your child is still in infancy, you're going to want to use infant-directed speech with them. This is the type of slow, grammatically simple baby talk that most likely comes naturally to the majority. While the grammatical simplicity is useful at early stages of infancy for helping the child develop a basic working knowledge of the language that will help them later to apply this to a syntactic bootstrapping method, the primary advantage of baby talk or infant-directed speech is that it allows the child to get comfortable with the phonetics of the language, actually picking up and distinguishing words from one another. So during the stages of infancy, it is advantageous to use infant-directed speech and will give your child an upper hand in learning language. As the child develops and grows, it is important to slowly introduce more natural conversational English to them, using more grammatically correct phrases and allowing them to become truly comfortable with the syntax of the language that you're teaching them. Ultimately, the more a child is exposed to a language in the form that it will be presented to them in the future, the more of an advantage they have in learning language. And it's also important to note that the younger the child is, the more of an advantage they have to learning language. There is undoubtedly a biologically optimal period of language learning, and we see this in cases of children who have had little to no language exposure up until a later period of their life. This can be seen in the story of a girl, Jeannie, who was found at 13 years old from an abusive home that had little to no communication. Having only been properly exposed to language at 13 years old, Jeannie was never able to progress past the toddler stage of linguistic development. While this story is far beyond what is ordinary, this extreme example helps illustrate that there is a specific temporal period in which children develop linguistically, and that starting younger and introducing more complex grammar can be advantageous to the child in the future. In not only linguistics, but all fields of development, children who are proficient at something at an early age will generally be proficient compared to peers at a later age as well, meaning that introducing more grammatically complex sentences and increasing the vocabulary to your toddler might be advantageous to their development. Hopefully, equipped with this knowledge, you can feel more confident in helping your child's linguistic development, and recognizing that due to the underlying mechanics of linguistic development, simply exposing your child to natural conversational English, or whatever language you're teaching them, is the most advantageous to helping them learn the language.